Good morning, Dr. Gerry. How are you?
Good morning, Yusra. How are you? I'm
Um, I'm,
great.
I'm fine. Thank you so much. And thank you for accepting the invitation to be my guest for the Ikigai and Kaizen podcast.
I'm very happy to be here.
So, for whoever is watching us, Happy New Year. And this is the first episode in the Ikigai and Kaizen podcast in 2025. And it's my great pleasure to have Dr. Gerry Yokota, who is based in Japan, with me now in the Ikigai and Kaizen podcast. So, Dr. Gerry, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So to introduce you, Dr. Gerry, so you are an acknowledged professional and a teacher who is really experienced in cross-cultural and interdisciplinary studies. And I will let you introduce yourself the way you are most comfortable with. So, Dr. Gerry, you are.
Thank you. Yes, I have been living in Japan for almost 40 years, and was teaching full time at Osaka University for over 30 years. And I retired from my full-time tenured position there, but then because Japan has an early retirement age, especially at the national universities, but then I had the great honor of being invited to continue teaching at a private university that has a longer, later retirement age. So I've continued teaching in that position, but now I'm sort of looking for the next stage of my life. I'm very excited about this, and I'm very excited to share what I've learned along the way. And I hope it may be beneficial to other people who are looking for their Ikigai.
Yes, thank you so much. And first, Dr. Gerry will start by talking about Ikigai. So I'm happy really that I'm interviewing more people now from Japan. And I'm curious to know more about the term beyond what the West knows about Ikigai. So how is the
Mhm.
term perceived in Japan from the cultural point of view, from, daily life? How do people perceive Ikigai and how do they fulfill life according to that?
Yeah, of course, I can't speak for all Japanese people. I'm an American here in Japan, and I can't give any sort of authoritative definition, but I can just give you a sense of how, I feel it really. People do talk about it and really do seem to care about it. Most of my information about it comes from, well, the contemporary proponent of Ikigai, who is also, is very popular in contemporary popular culture and in mass media, is a scholar named Mogi Ken, who's written a book called Ikigai that I'm sure you're familiar with. And, many of the things that he writes in that book, I think, are very commonly known. The ideas about harmony and sustainability and about starting small, and releasing yourself or freeing and liberating yourself from, the things that aren't so important to get a really sense of what's really important to you. But I also, one thing I found that a lot of contemporary people are not as aware of is that there was actually one earlier scholar who had written a very famous book, around the war generation. Her name is Mieko Kamiya. And I really also appreciate her work and her background. She was a psychiatrist, and she especially worked with people with Hansen's disease. And, so that was very much a mission for her. And so I really also like to introduce her to people who are interested in talking about this topic.
Thank you so much for clarifying the meaning of Ikigai. And I am sure and I'm really aware that everybody has their own perception about the term. And even in my real life, I do not want to frame things. And the whole podcast is all about that. It's about perceiving unique, but at the same time, different perceptions of one's life according to this principle, to Ikigai, and also Kaizen, that we're going to explore step by step, just like the term, embodies in itself, how to evolve through small steps and gradually. So,
Yeah.
Ikigai, for instance, can be something for someone, which means a life purpose to someone and a different aspect to someone else. For instance, someone can be really fond of reading and can find really an enormous pleasure reading about other cultures, discovering that. Other people can be fond of traveling. That's their own way of knowing more about the other, if we can might call it the other, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
as a subject. So,
Mm-hmm.
Ikigai, in the sense, the podcast itself is my Ikigai. It's like
Mm-hmm.
I have found, a pleasure to know friends around the world. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
based in Tunisia, but this
Mm-hmm.
does not prevent me from having friends all over the world. So
Yeah.
since COVID, I started networking, but not networking in the professional sense. It's like expanding, my friend zone with people from all over the world,
Mm-hmm.
from the USA to Africa to North Africa to Europe, Japan. So there are still, other people that I still do not know all over the world, such as, for instance, I did not interview people from New Zealand. What else? For instance, I've interviewed people from South America, but still, this is, let's say, a safe place and a space to whoever wants to share their story,
Mm-hmm.
a story about their
Yeah.
life, about what they see as a source of happiness. And
Yeah.
so, asking you the question, Dr. Gerry, about your ikigai, let's say, the happiness zone in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, where do you find yourself most comfortable with in your life? Is it your teaching position? You were teaching as a profession? Is
Mm-hmm.
it living in a country you like?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to really kind of give you a specific, a question, but I will let you talk about what makes you happy. What is happiness according to you, Dr. Cherry?
Okay, thank you. First, before I start talking about my happiness and Ikigai, I just like to say, Yusra, you are like lit up here. And it's clear to me that you have found your Ikigai with your podcast. It just shows you're just glowing when you talk about that. And it's great to see. It's
Thank
just
you.
great to see. And
Thank
I
you.
want to acknowledge you for that.
Thank you so much.
For myself, yeah, I think I was pretty clear by the time I was in junior high school or getting into high school that I wanted to teach. I wasn't sure what level. At the time I wasn't thinking of, becoming a university professor, but I knew I wanted to teach. And I did start having a sense of a mission even as early as I would say junior high school. Because for me, um, okay, I grew up in the era of the civil rights movement in the United States. I was in elementary school, and I remember, for example, when President Kennedy was assassinated. I remember when Martin Luther King was assassinated. I remember when Muhammad Ali brought his gold medal home from the Olympics and threw it into the Kentucky River because he walked into a restaurant and they wouldn't serve him. And and this was also the time of the Vietnam War. And I and especially the words of Muhammad Ali affected me very strongly when he said, "Why are these, rich white people sending us poor black people over to Vietnam to kill these poor yellow people?" And to him it was just absurd. And that was my awakening, really. I had seen, of course, um, racism all around me, especially towards Black Americans, and I had experienced some also as an Asian, an American, as a Japanese American. But those were the words that really sort of set me on my mission, and that just reinforced my desire to be a teacher where I could teach, about, yeah, overcoming the racism as well as sexism. But actually, because I now teach gender studies, a lot of people think that sexism would be my primary concern, but it was actually first for me, it was racism, and then I saw how they intersect,
Yeah.
and that also just deepened my sense of mission and wanting to get into the teaching profession to make a difference. Mhm.
You remind me with a lot of, memories when it comes to my MA in cross-cultural studies. And, part of that was the cross-cultural interchange, and part of that was womanism and African American women. And, there is a subject which was called world poetry. So we used to study a lot of that, let's call it pollination between all the cultures all over the world. So that intersection, how do people express themselves through arts, through music, through paintings? So it's extremely interesting that someone finds their own identity in the world, and they can express it the way they feel most comfortable with. And as you mentioned, when it comes to racism, it's like maybe it's fear from accepting other people's differences. So embracing that difference now is key. And accepting the others the way they are is really essentially important, because we can't treat people and deal with them according to our value system of values. So everybody has a distinct and different one. So, and according to that, we should respect that really accordingly. And going back to that, I remember my first experience teaching The Wasteland as well by T.S. Eliot, and in how difficult it was at the beginning. I was inspired by a teacher of mine, and in his teaching style. So my experience to teaching and Ikigai and teaching goes back to that in a sense. I've learned the intertextual aspect in all its sense, and I've learned that we are kind of embody that polyvalent aspect in ourselves. Intertextuality in The Wasteland is like, it reflects even the human psyche. So we're a patchwork of all of that, a mosaic of that. So, and that what makes us rich as human beings and makes us really unique in the same sense.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask you a question, Dr. Gerry. What is teaching according to you? What is, it doesn't have to be, fit into the answer that I've just mentioned or what I'm expecting. So what's your own perception of teaching in your field of studies?
Right. Well, I mean, ideally, of course, it's co-learning, because I learn as much, from my interactions with my students as I hope they learn from me. And you also make me realize, I'm not always, very conscious at the very highly conscious level of, the different aspects of Ikigai. And it was just as I was, thinking about our preparing for our talk today, and I was looking at the diagram again, and I noticed, that mission was there, and I realized I don't usually think of it as a mission on a daily basis, but it was definitely that's something that motivated me at the time I was, designing my life and thinking about my career. But it's not the most prominent, I would say, motivating factor. It's very, although it may have been so initially. I think, now it's much more passion. Yeah. And although, I've gone through periods in my career where the passion also sort of ebbed and flowed. And sometimes I let the passion kind of get weak because of other pressures. And then I realized I've got to, get back to that. But right now I'm in a really high passion place, and the mission, that was more important at the beginning, but now it's more like, it's down there in the foundation, but it's not what drives me as much as it did, in the earlier days. Yeah. So it's interesting. Thank you. That question really made me think about that. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing. Thank you so much. And please, Gerry, do not stick to the diagram. I know that I've shared
Yeah.
the idea of the diagram with you, but this podcast is an opportunity to go beyond those, let's say frontiers, limits,
Ye-
bridges.
Yes.
Let us
Yeah.
go beyond all of that. I'm pursuing research about what is happiness, honestly, and it is different. We cannot frame happiness. So
Mm.
same as Ikigai. So the
Mhm.
diagram might be sometimes a way, like, to try to understand a little bit the term, but the
Right.
term, please do not limit yourself with mission, vision, passion,
Yes.
profession, what you can be
Sure.
paid for, because not everything is linked to money. Most of the things we're happy about, they're not linked to money. So
Mhm.
when you say passion, I really see that and feel it, especially in
Mm.
the way you convey this. And lucky are you students, to study and to be, in your class. So,
Mhm.
can you tell us more about what you teach, Gerry? Let's say more specifically. So, I know that you deal with the interdisciplinary cross-cultural studies, but I'm
Mhm.
curious to know more about that.
Mhm.
What do you exactly teach? So,
Okay. Yeah.
please go
So
ahead.
as I mentioned, my situation has changed, recently because after retiring, before retirement, in addition to my undergraduate classes, I also taught in the graduate school. I had master's students and, supervised doctoral dissertations. In my current position, I'm only teaching undergraduates. And I kind of miss, my graduate students and that high level, research guidance. But I'm really rediscovering, I think, the pleasure of teaching undergraduates, and especially, I teach two different areas, but one is I teach gender and public policy as in an EMI class for public policy majors, so they're all international students. But I'm teaching them in English, as the lingua franca for the international students, including some Japanese students also, who are studying public policy. And so there I combine some of the work I used to do with undergraduates when I was teaching academic English at Osaka University, where I like to, my specialty and my approach to teaching English, and also, in also teaching in English, is cognitive linguistics, is basically my original sort of approach, and especially the use of metaphors and images and symbols. And there's a game I love to play in my classes, and it's called metaphor spotting.
Oh,
And especially in my public policy class, what we do is we have a bit of fun with popular culture because we look at music and movies and art, and we play our metaphor spotting game, or our symbols and our images. And what we talk about is, to what degree can popular culture, like whether it's hip hop music or Hollywood movies or whatever, actually influence public opinion to the degree that it actually influences public policy. Like what celebrities perform at the president's inauguration. I mean, this is it's rather American centered. I agree. I mean, I admit, but so that connection between popular culture and public policy, via public opinion. So that's why we get to sneak in lots of music and movies, into our public policy classroom and look at the metaphors and the symbols and talk about how they can be influencing our ways of thinking and perception. Um, because if you're familiar, with cognitive linguistics and the idea that metaphor, I think a lot of people think it's just a way to kind of dress up your language, to make you sound a little more poetic or a little, fashionable or whatever. But it's not just decoration. It's really, according to brain science, right? It's neuroscience. Really, metaphors are the building blocks of communication, especially intercultural communication. Because when you're having problems translating things, like literally, or explaining unfamiliar concepts, if you can't get it through by direct, communication, you
yes,
can you
those
can
metaphors.
communicate with metaphor, right? And so I that's a very big cornerstone of my teaching, especially in these intercultural settings. Yeah.
And the point,
Uh,
yes, yes, please go ahead. Sorry
no,
to
that's it.
interrupt.
Yeah, I think that's the main example I wanted to share. Yeah.
I'd like to hear more from you, but elaborating on what you mentioned about metaphors. Metaphors can be conceived differently according to cultures. You know, a metaphor
Right.
in my culture can be different in
Hmm.
other people's
Hmm.
cultures. So
Yeah.
sometimes it's good to be culture wise a little bit to understand.
Hmm. Hmm.
For instance, if I might use a metaphor, you know, in the street, and I'm in a, let's say, a multicultural country, let's say,
Hmm.
someone else might perceive it as impolite sometimes. Other people might perceive it
Right.
extremely polite. What is this?
Right.
So it's really important to study that because
Yeah.
there is a whole cognitive aspect that goes beyond that. Other people
Yeah.
sometimes they tend to use, you know, jokes sometimes to kind of
Hmm.
sugarcoat what they want to say to people. So in the
Hmm.
communicative aspect, you know, there are a lot of things that are perceived from sender to receiver, but according to cultures, of course. So I'm
Hmm.
interested to hearing more from that. So apart from metaphors,
Yeah.
Gerry, what kind of teaching techniques did you use to teach, let's say, using arts, bringing arts into the class?
Hmm. So, for example, when we listen to music, I think a lot of times our favorite music artists, we're first drawn to the sound, right? To the melody, to the beat, something we can dance to, right? And we're not really listening that closely to the lyrics very often. But when you do actually listen to them and appreciate the poetry in them and the metaphors and the symbols there, then it really adds a whole dimension, I think, to your aesthetic experience. And I totally agree with you about how cultures, different metaphors can have different meanings in different cultures. But I like to think of that not as a barrier, but as a place to
Yes.
play and a place to interact and to share. And even, I always encourage my students to be creative in using their metaphors and their language. Don't be afraid of making a mistake and using a metaphor that's
Sure.
not, commonly used in English because what it does is open space for communication. And you can say, well, in my culture, but just be aware of that difference and say, well, in my culture, this metaphor means this. What does it mean in your culture? And it's a great communication, a pathway to communication to talk about those differences. But mainly, I just like to encourage students, to be aware of the power of language, and the responsibility to use language, not just in terms of rigidly following rules, but be responsibly aware of the possible differences. And as you're also saying, that gap between the intention and the effect, and always be aware that what your intention is not necessarily everyone's
Well,
intention,
yes.
or perception. Yeah. But I find that's just a great play space for, deepening communication. Yeah.
I learned myself a lot from the multilingual classroom because I've been part, you know, part of my career path is teaching at international schools. So I'm a
Hmm.
higher education teacher, essentially. That's what I'm doing now. But I had, you know, after my CELTA, I had that, maybe as a goal to teach, you know, let's say lower levels, lower students
Hmm.
levels. So I taught middle school students and I
Hmm.
learned a lot myself as a teacher from those different cultures, as a tapestry, as a mosaic,
Yeah.
as I mentioned,
Mm.
especially in events. So we used to hold events at that time, and every student represents their country through songs, poetry, clothes, food. It was
Yeah.
amazing. So for us
Mm.
teachers to learn without necessarily having to travel to those countries. So,
Yes.
and I still remember the experience with my drama theater class. I used to teach the same class, and we
Hmm.
used to have, you know, a unit, like part of the teaching practice at that time was related to improvisation in drama. So, and
Mm.
I was amazed by, you know, the background knowledge that everyone brought to the table at that time. So, students from
Mhm.
all over the world, from expats living in my country, you know, there were expat children. So, myself included, I learned So I'm a learner myself in my class. So beyond being, I really believe, in that cross-cultural interchange, that co-creative space with my students. And I've learned a lot from their language. So that's what I kept on doing. When I travel in my podcast, I used to have a question, as I told you at the beginning, before recording even this, I used to have one question with the people that I interview from different parts of the world in their native language. So that to learn from them as well and enable them to use their language as well. And sometimes, most of the time, I had some colleagues never using their native language because they went so far away from their native country, so that sometimes they embrace the new language, they embrace the new culture they're living.
Mhm.
But I totally agree with you. And I believe in using arts in my classroom. So we've talked about your passion for teaching, and I really learned a lot from you talking about your teaching practice. Now, the question is, how do you think your teaching practice evolved over time? So you started with interdisciplinary studies. So how
Mhm.
did it evolve over time until today?
Right. So actually, when I first came to Japan, I came to do my dissertation research. And my original career goal was to write my dissertation and publish my first book about Japanese culture, and then go back to the United States and get a job teaching Japanese culture. But sort of fate intervened, and I was invited to apply for this job. And I just really liked it because it seemed like it was going to offer me such flexibility because I could teach in English, like using English as a medium of instruction. And also, when I would, then when I would be promoted, and after I got my PhD and was promoted, then, I would have my own master's and doctoral seminars. And there, that would be totally content courses. And I would be teaching basically gender theory for humanities majors. But I would also be teaching those, to advanced students in the graduate school. I'd also be teaching those in English. And although I started teaching a few undergraduate English classes at first, basically what I was able to do is eventually, it's kind of like a bartering system where other faculties ask you to come and teach like an EMI content course in their faculty, and then the university barters to then get someone else to teach your English class for you. And I never completely got away from English teaching. I loved it. But what I was able to do to, find my Ikigai in all of those teaching situations is that in my English classes for Japanese students, what I would focus on is how to introduce Japanese culture to non-Japanese. Like because, there's a strong emphasis on going and studying abroad. So I said, when you go overseas, you're going to want to tell people overseas about your culture, right? So there's a very strong emphasis on that. And not only the traditional culture, which was my original major, I was studied the No drama, like Tale of Genji, Tales of the Heike, and so on. But I also was looking at how traditional culture is received in the contemporary world. It's not just like a museum, a fossil in a museum. It's still very much a living tradition, even the No drama, which is like 600, 700 years old, and they're still performing many of the same plays that were written 700 years ago, but they keep them fresh. And how they do that to me is just such an amazing, it's a mystery, and it's just fascinating. And I see that also as informing my idea of Ikigai, and, that idea of releasing, or shedding all the things you don't need, to really keep, so you can always be present in the moment. And that's what the No drama means to me. And if I may, because it's just at the New Year, I'd like to share something with you. Actually, I got this beautiful New Year's card from an artist friend. Uh, because this year in Japan is the year of the snake,
Thank you.
right?
Yeah,
And snake is not everyone's favorite animal,
I know.
but she puts a beautiful, wise twist on it. If you can read it there, it says, shedding something old makes space for something new. It
Oh,
shows the snake shedding its skin down here. And I just had to share that with you. It just seemed like a perfect fit for this conversation.
you speak
Yeah.
my language. Thank you.
Yeah, but I love that idea of, the interaction, between the traditional and the contemporary. Yeah.
Exactly.
Mhm.
So it's like when you shed a skin, just like a snake, when you get rid of the
Yeah.
old, you create space for the new to be existent. And
Yes.
I like this metaphor, by the way. So we've been talking about
Mhm.
metaphors. I like to use metaphors a lot in my teaching practice and philosophy as a coach,
Mhm.
everything. So I use the butterfly metaphor myself. So the transformation
Yeah.
aspect from a cocoon to the butterfly, and I use it
Mhm.
as a coach in the sense. So when I kind of guide and facilitate the coachee from point A to point Z, they see themselves really in all those aspects. So from cocooning
Yeah.
a little bit until they can be a butterfly and they can fly using their own wings. Thanks for sharing,
Yeah.
Dr. Jerry.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I wish they it could have been one of your supervisees, you know? I wish they could have been one of your students, talking about this. If ever, please, you had any courses recorded or any notes, any books, please feel free to share them. I'd be glad to read anything,
Yeah.
that you've been working on. And lucky all your students again.
Yeah,
So,
I'm happy to share. I
yeah,
do have a lot of my publications. I have a website at academia.com, and I do upload anything that's out of copyright, or I
yeah.
don't doesn't have publication restrictions. Yeah, I've put a lot of my things
I
up
saw
there.
that. I saw that, before interviewing you, Dr. Jerry, allow me to tell you, apart from the bio, apart from everything, so I'm interested in knowing that footprint, that blueprint of the people that I'm talking to online. And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, I admire everything that you mentioned, So it was a whole list. I've checked, the open access publications that you had, the list, but not in details.
Yeah.
And I said, it's amazing. And it's a privilege to everybody who's going to listen to you today. And thank you so much again. And talking about your teaching practice. So, and talking about the Japanese culture, before talking a
Mm-hmm.
little bit about my own, not perception of culture, but the way I prefer the word culture, maybe I use it in my own sense. So,
Mm-hmm.
what is culture according to you, Dr. Jerry? So a lot of people
Oh
sometimes
gosh.
they see, yeah. Sometimes, for Arabs, for North African, for people, they see our
Mm.
culture, as, the desert, as, songs, whatever they see on social media, whatever they see from movies, whatever. So, but if we have, for instance, not we have, if we can, not define
Mm-hmm.
culture, but try to understand it. What is culture?
Mm-hmm.
What's culture? According to you.
Yeah, that's another thing where it may seem cowardly, but it's as I said at the beginning when we were talking about Ikigai is also something I'm not sure it's useful to try to narrow down to some
Yes.
authoritative
Yeah. Yeah.
definition. I think that's something else that can be negotiated with the people you're communicating with.
Yeah.
And because there may be some cultural differences also, intercultural differences in how different people define culture. So I think, it's an interesting example of how to bridge that gap between the local and the global, right? Or the
Yes.
glocal,
Yes.
and just find out what it means to the person who be here now with this person and how they perceive it and negotiate that space and find the similarities and the differences. That's what I would always aim to do. Yeah.
Yeah, so and that inclusive, their definition is not definition, but it's like very inclusive perception to culture. It's like you give that open space, and so do I, to people to be in themselves, But for that mutual understanding, sometimes it's good to understand. Sometimes, no, I don't call them limits, but politeness, respect.
Hmm.
For instance, some things are allowed in one culture and not allowed in other cultures. What
Hmm.
else? I don't know. Sometimes in a culture, nodding too much is not it's not a good sign. For instance, in other cultures, it's a good sign. So, but this is
Mm,
like from you to understand and not to try to find an
mhm,
authoritative definition, not to frame it.
mhm,
So, on the contrary, it's like trying to understand more of each other in for
mhm,
that
mhm,
coexistence. So
mhm,
myself, how I perceive culture, I perceive it as the richness of being oneself by also
mhm,
interacting with others. So I
mhm,
believe that I'm a global citizen. And I'm
mhm,
bringing those aspects from the place where I live in, from the culture,
mhm,
from beyond food and clothes and all the the stereotypical vision to what can be a culture. But I bring
mhm.
the culture of kindness. I bring the culture of being humane with others. So that's how I perceive culture to try to let's say. Um, being the best version of oneself and at the same time enable others to be in themselves. So that's for
Yeah.
allowing diversity to exist.
Right. Yeah. And if I could just go back a bit to something you said about how, different cultures do have different do's and don'ts, what is acceptable and unacceptable and so on. Just from my particular approach to intercultural communication, there's just one caveat I'd like to point out there. And that is sometimes culture can be used, and I would say even, misused or abused as an excuse for human rights violations. And so, where do the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, what do you do when it comes into conflict with some local culture? And is it possible that sometimes people are using culture just as an excuse or a justification for something that shouldn't be, justified? And so this is where I actually, in my, intercultural communication teaching, also like to be aware of some of the great lessons I have learned from peace studies, especially a scholar named Johan Galtung, who, defined like violence. And, I think violence can be a very vague term, and we need to distinguish, different kinds of violence, like the personal violence, like, the physical violence, as opposed to the
Verbal
verbal violence that may be between individuals, right? As opposed to what, if
culture.
you're interested in like anti-racism work, the problem of structural violence, right? The idea that racism is a structural issue. It's not just one racist person, and
Mm.
against another. But the interesting thing about Galton's work that I also think could really inform these discussions about intercultural communication and multiculturalism is that in his original formulation, he mainly just talked about the personal versus the structural. But then later, in his later work, he added to that the idea of cultural violence. And I think this is an idea that can really inform us as teachers of intercultural communication to be sure that culture is not being used as a weapon, yeah, as a violent weapon.
It can be.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can be for sure. And sometimes we can notice this, in mass media, in movie,
Hmm.
in those, implicit and subliminal messages that no one can really understand from, basic level of consciousness. So it's like what lies beneath. So
Yes.
especially nowadays in songs, in movies, sometimes I just look for, honestly, for a movie to watch just which can be devoid, we cannot find it, devoid of, cultural violence. Let's call it this way,
Mhm.
in the sense that a culture might be abused because another culture considers itself as superior, for historically speaking, for colonization, for
Mhm.
all those, what happened in history previously. But you cannot.
Right.
Even cartoons, they're really deeply infused, with those messages. So
Yes.
it's like if you're aware of those messages, you can never watch, you
Mhm.
can never take it at a surface level. You always try to understand in what's the meaning of this? Why was this said? And why does this person really behave in this sense? If that was the opposite, maybe the other way around, would that happened? Would have that happened in the movie, in that sense? Even in books, being culturally aware is really, really important, especially for someone who is working or who lives in a multicultural, context. So that, to create that safe space for others. So really talking about this with you as an expert in the field is really very, very, the conversation cannot really end today, but I'm really aware of time, so I'll try
Yes.
to make it really quick. So the next question will be about the future Dr. Gerry. uh
Hmm.
we've talked about whatever you've been doing now until now in education. So if
Hmm.
I ask you a question about your future self, how do you perceive yourself in the future?
Yeah. Yeah. So I know, your podcasts, touch on both Ikigai and Kaizen. And so when I was thinking about, your work on Kaizen and especially the idea of SMART goals, I will sort of go out on a limb here and say something I'm thinking because I am now again at another transition point in my career where I'm looking, I'm not going to be teaching in the traditional classroom much longer. So I need to be looking ahead. So where am I going to find my next turf? And I have been thinking about actually becoming a YouTuber. And a lot of people have said to me that, it's just a kind of a waste that so many of my lectures, were just kind of one off, right? And that I could re-edit them, because my lectures are always, lavishly illustrated with images, like from the No drama or from anime or from whatever.
Yes.
And so, combining, I do believe the visual aspect is very important for the areas that I work in. So I probably wouldn't do just an audio podcast, but really want to have a YouTube channel where I could, not like a 90-minute lecture like I would do at the university, but even maybe just like a 15-minute, little samples of what you can learn, of Japanese culture for the English speaking world. So I have not haven't done anything concrete about this yet, but it's an idea that I am currently percolating.
And I have a suggestion for you, but I'll be among the first beneficials, from this suggestion is that if ever you could create like e-courses, short video recorded courses for
Oh.
people who would like to purchase them, to watch them, to get training on what you're teaching in
Hmm.
cross-cultural studies and that interdisciplinary field. So having your lectures plus new ones.
Hmm.
What about exploring this? Because I'm doing this myself, so in my free time. But
Hmm.
from experts like you, Dr. Gerry, we would like really, honestly, as someone who is really fascinated by the culture and by what you're doing, would love to have those courses. Would love to have you, teach us more of that pedagogy in class. Teach us more of how you use um, art in class, how you analyze,
Mm.
because taking that in my MA, and now doing it and teaching it, that's good. But maybe for others who did not get the chance to really to have access to such courses, it would be a great idea. So what do you think of maybe exploring that?
Yeah, thank you for suggesting it. Yeah,
So it would be something really nice.
it
Plus,
excites me. Yeah, makes me happy.
I could see that. I noticed.
Mhm.
I was about to tell you that I noticed that really your energy, is uplifted when you started
Mhm.
talking about your lectures, collecting all of that, and
Mhm.
might be useful to everybody, including myself. So please do, if ever you had the chance to do it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I could also see I was kind of jumping up in my chair here. There.
I'm happy talking about this. Yes. It made me want to go and travel to Japan, and record you, for real, be there
Oh,
as
I
your
hope you
assistant.
can come. Yes, I'd love to welcome you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Gerry. And so today we had the pleasure of talking to Dr. Gerry Yokota, who is an acknowledged and experienced teacher in interdisciplinary cross-cultural studies in Japan. And Dr. Gerry, I will let you say something before we wrap up the podcast, something you would like to tell us at the end of today's episode.
Okay. Well, it's almost like I guess, yeah, the main thing I'd like to share now is it's almost like a little confession, but recently, I've been thinking about future careers and I have been considering, how much of a career I could make of public speaking, because I do think that is one of my biggest skills. But actually, recently, I've become aware as I've been exploring, trying to not just only build on my strengths, but also to strengthen my weaknesses and not give up on things I think I could never do that, right? And not give up on not become resigned about those things because I've heard it said that if you only focus on your strengths, you get off balance and you're not really integrating. So one thing I've realized recently is that I'm very good at public speaking, I think. I can get up on a stage in front of like 1,000 people, give a plenary keynote speech at an international conference. I don't get stage fright. I'm
Yeah.
totally comfortable.
Yes.
But what I realized, Yusra, is that I'm not comfortable in small groups or in like one-to-one conversation, especially with people, I don't know very well. I get scared. I get stage fright in a one-to-one situation. And so I've been working on that for myself lately, and I've just been having many, many joyful experiences of reconnecting with people that I had been out of touch with and discovering, making so many discoveries and just being more authentic instead of just always putting on, a kind of a pretense.
Yes,
And it has brought me such joy
it is.
that I also want to really encourage people to keep that balance,
It is.
yeah,
It
in
is.
their public speaking, but also in their private and personal communication and relationships. Yeah.
Allow me, please, to share, something about this because, as teachers, usually we don't have that, public speaking fright, and anxiety. We teach in class, we're very active, and at conferences, it's the same, just like when you mentioned. But once I started this podcast myself, I used to be very shy a little bit, shy to not in the sense to approach people, not to talk. It's like, how would people perceive it, for instance? Would that be perfect? So then I learned that it doesn't have to be perfect. So I just run the risk. I jumped into the water. I started the audio version of this. I got the support from all of my friends who really, they were my guests at the beginning with the audio version. And then Dr. Liz England encouraged me into going into the video version of this by being a guest in the same podcast that I was starting the first version of the video cast. So she was there. And then I started to go back to all of those conversations that I had and kept as audio, asking for permission from my friends if ever I can share the video format. It was not perfect. Going back now to my YouTube channel, I recognize the fact how I evolved myself speaking to, as you said, one-to-one, on camera, on screen. It's not easy at all. It's not. So I learned how to deliver speeches. So I also was, and I'm still a member at Toastmasters International. So how to frame that, how to focus on one point, how to argument well that point. So being public speaker is different in different contexts. So and sometimes you might be very well prepared. A lot of people, they start with prepare a set of questions and they follow them. It feels like it's mechanical. So for me, what I do, just like the questions that I shared with you before, I keep like a skeleton so that my guest feels well at ease. So this is the framework. We're going to grab gravitate
Yeah,
around this.
skeleton.
But
Mm.
we'll allow ourselves like to improvise a little bit. And I follow my guests. So if someone is really an
Mm.
expert in movies, I would like to listen more
Mhm.
from that. I would like to learn
Yeah,
from this. So I might not
yeah.
get another chance to do it sometimes. So this
Hmm.
so is like a chance for anyone,
Yeah.
for me first, and for anyone first and foremost who would like to share their life, their story. It's not easy to share one's life, one story.
Hmm. Hmm. But
If you
you
ask,
sure know how to draw people out. Yeah.
it's someone's identity, Dr. Gerry. So if someone is asked a question and they've never learned sometimes to frame that identity in that same
Hmm.
question. So and they're careful about their public image. So
Hmm.
as a host myself, I'm careful what to ask, what to
Hmm.
say.
Hmm.
If the question is, I make sure I don't ask sensitive questions to keep the
Yeah.
guests
Yeah.
well at ease. So to keep it short, public speaking is very inspiring, and we evolve in this. And this
Mhm.
podcast is far from being an excellent one. I still lack few aspects, but I'm doing a lot of things to improve it. But you know
Yeah.
what? The most basic thing which makes out of this connection really important is the human connection.
Hmm.
That's really the most important thing. Yeah,
Yeah. And the listening. Yeah, the listening and just being there for the person.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you so much. And I'm
Thank
really honored,
you.
deeply honored. And now you want me more.
Likewise.
Yes, you want me more now to go and visit Japan for real. So that will be on my bucket list for the
I'll
next
be here.
few years to come. I'll get in touch. I'll let you know. And thank you so much for sharing your story, your
And thank you for
Ikigai.
having me.
Thank you. Yourself. Thank you so much for sharing everything, Dr. Gerry. And if you want to add anything before I just, say wrap up the podcast and say goodbye to everyone, would you like to say anything at the end?
I'm good, but just thanks for listening, and I look forward to all the connections that this may lead to.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you so much to whoever is watching us or listening to us, because this podcast will be provided in a video format, in an audio format. Please take good care of yourselves and have a fabulous and wonderful new year, be it the snake year in Japan, or be it a new year here, or be it in a new year in any part of the world. Just embrace being yourselves. Have fun, enjoy life, stay blessed and stay safe. And thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.